In the mist-covered hills of western Pennsylvania, scattered among aging chapels and weather-worn meeting houses, lie relics that no archivist has ever been able to properly document. Within gilded containers tucked behind altar cloths and locked inside wooden sacristies rest fragments of bone and preserved tissue objects, long venerated, yet quietly stripped of verifiable origin. Between the years 1745 and 1792, more than 70 colonists disappeared from settlements stretching from Philadelphia into the frontier wilderness. Devout parishioners, quiet farmers, widows, and most unsettling of all, children with no surviving kin. Each loss was explained away by illness, migration, or divine calling. In time, several were elevated as examples of spiritual sacrifice, but a different story was recorded. Hidden within a restricted archive in Philadelphia lies a document containing 3 sworn testimonies. Their statements describe a workshop concealed beyond the tree line of Chester County, a place operated by a respected artisan family, a place where bodies were not buried, but repurposed. For decades, the record remained sealed at the insistence of prominent church authorities. What follows is not folklore. It is a reconstruction based on fragments deliberately forgotten. Before we continue, consider subscribing if you are drawn to the shadows of history. The chapters that polite society prefers remain closed. Share in the comments where you're listening from. Sometimes the oldest buildings hold the longest memories. Now, we step back into colonial Pennsylvania. In the mid-18th century, Pennsylvania was considered a sanctuary of faith. Philadelphia thrived under Quaker influence, while the western frontier grew restless with Presbyterian, Lutheran, and independent Protestant congregations carving meeting houses from timber and stone. It was a land of scripture, discipline, and expanding borders. The Whitmore family arrived from England in 1742. They settled west of Philadelphia, in Chester County, where farmland dissolved into dense woodland. The patriarch, Nathaniel Whitmore, introduced himself as a master craftsman specializing in sacred objects, communion vessels, candle stands, engraved reliquary cases, and ornate bindings for family Bibles. His workmanship was extraordinary. Ministers praised the refinement of his carvings. Elders admired the intricate metalwork. His workshop, a tall timber structure built at the edge of a heavily wooded property, became a quiet destination for clergy seeking commissioned pieces. The building itself was unremarkable at first glance: broad windows, double doors, and the steady rhythm of tools striking wood and metal. Deliveries arrived discreetly. Visitors rarely lingered. Nathaniel's wife Elizabeth carried herself with composed restraint. Neighbors described her as disciplined, devout, and unwaveringly calm. She maintained the household with precision, raising 4 children who mirrored her controlled demeanor. The family attended services faithfully. They spoke rarely, but when they did, their reflections on Scripture carried unusual gravity. Their eldest son, Thomas, apprenticed under Nathaniel, learning the delicate art of shaping sacred vessels. The daughters assisted Elizabeth within the home, and the youngest child, William, was said to wander the tree line frequently, watching the forest with quiet fascination. Over time, Nathaniel's commissions shifted. Congregations began requesting more elaborate reliquaries, containers designed not merely for symbolism, but for preservation. Small fragments, encased in velvet, framed in silver. Their provenance was seldom questioned. After all, the Whitmores were respected, trusted, devout. But in 1761, something changed. A traveling preacher passing through Chester County reported the disappearance of 2 orphan siblings last seen near Harmony Meeting House. The matter stirred whispers, then faded. Frontier life was harsh. Disappearances were not uncommon. And, within months, a new reliquary appeared in a neighboring congregation, its contents described only as sacred remains of uncommon purity. Similar patterns followed. A widow vanished after evening prayer. A farmhand failed to return from a church errand. Each time, grief was met with reassurance. Faith required sacrifice. The Lord called whom he willed. But 3 individuals whose names remain redacted in the sealed testimony grew suspicious. One claimed to have followed a covered wagon from a remote burial site to the Whitmore property under the cover of darkness. Another described a strange metallic scent drifting from the workshop after midnight. The third spoke of ledger entries carefully coded referencing deliveries, preparation, and consecration. What they discovered inside the timber building shattered any illusion of sanctity. Behind the main workspace, concealed beyond a partition wall, lay a secondary chamber. Their tools, intended for fine craftsmanship, were accompanied by instruments designed for preservation. Hooks, tables, containers of chemical solutions uncommon to rural artisans. According to the testimony, the Whitmore enterprise operated under the justification of divine transformation. The body, they believed, was merely a vessel, and vessels could be remade. Over nearly 5 decades, relics attributed to unnamed martyrs circulated across frontier churches. Congregations believed they were honoring saints. Instead, they were venerating victims. The records end abruptly in 1792. The workshop was found abandoned. The family vanished without formal notice. The property was reclaimed and later rebuilt. Officially, no wrongdoing was ever acknowledged. The reliquaries, however, remained displayed, revered, undisturbed, and somewhere in a restricted archive. The testimonies still wait sealed, not by time, but by agreement. The youngest Whitmore child, William, was a thin and watchful boy, whose pale features contrasted sharply with the intensity in his eyes. He spent long hours wandering the tree line beyond the family property, returning with strange botanical samples and small animal remains which he carefully dried, cataloged, and stored in wooden cases beneath his bed. His parents praised his curiosity, calling it scientific discipline. Neighbors found it unusual, but harmless. Colonial life in Chester County was rarely gentle. Winters bit deep into bone. Crops failed without warning. Frontier tensions simmered constantly between settlers and the unknown wilderness pressing in around them. Yet this was also an era of fervent revival. Spiritual fires of the Great Awakening had left congregations hungry for visible signs of divine favor. Churches competed, not only in doctrine, but in presentation. Sacred artistry became a statement of legitimacy. Nathaniel Whitmore thrived in this climate. By 1745, his modest workshop had grown in both size and reputation. 2 young apprentices now assisted him. One was Jacob Miller, a soft-spoken orphan of German descent. The other, Peter Collins, had come from a struggling family in Philadelphia, seeking opportunity. Both worked long hours shaping wood and polishing metal under Nathaniel's stern instruction. To the public eye, the Whitmores embodied piety and industry. Behind closed doors, something else was taking form. It began in the final weeks of autumn in 1745. Mary Collins, a devout woman known throughout the county for tending to the ill and impoverished, vanished along a familiar road just as an early winter storm rolled across the hills. Her absence stirred concern at first, but frontier disappearances were tragically common. Rumors blamed wild animals. Others whispered of raiders. Eventually, the search efforts faded into resignation. But the stormy evening of November 17th would later resurface in a document discovered decades afterward. A handwritten confession. The account, attributed to Thomas Whitmore and reportedly penned near the end of his life, described his father watching Mary for weeks prior to her disappearance. Father said her goodness would sanctify the work, the document reads in trembling script. He believed certain souls carried a purity that could be preserved. That night, as wind tore through the trees and snow threatened the horizon, Nathaniel stepped from the forest edge carrying a lantern. He called out urgently as Mary approached the property, claiming young William had wandered off and failed to return. His voice, rehearsed yet convincing, carried just enough desperation to disarm suspicion. Mary followed him without hesitation. Thomas would later write that he observed from an upper window as they entered through the rear of the workshop hand entrance, partially hidden by pine boughs. Inside, the secondary room had already been prepared. Canvas sheets covered the floorboards. Metal instruments lay arranged with clinical precision. The confession falters at this point. What followed was never described in detail. But the days afterward were Nathaniel possessed knowledge uncommon for a colonial craftsman. Medical volumes imported from England outlined methods of preservation techniques designed for anatomical study. Under his direction, tissue was treated carefully to prevent decay. Salt, dried botanicals, and chemical mixtures were applied with calculated restraint. Elizabeth Whitmore stitched velvet pouches by candlelight, embroidering each with gold thread in the shape of crosses, vines, and sacred emblems. "Father said we were restoring holiness to Protestant lands," Thomas wrote. He claimed relics had once inspired awe and obedience. He believed we were chosen to restore that power. 2 weeks after Mary's disappearance, Nathaniel traveled east. He returned from Philadelphia wealthier and in higher demand. At the next meeting gathering, he delivered an exquisitely carved altar chest dedicated to Mary's memory. The congregation wept at his gesture. They praised his devotion. They admired the craftsmanship. Hidden within the inner lining of that chest can, sealed behind an elegant sliding panel, rested a fragment of preserved tissue. No one suspected, no one searched. And that single concealed relic marked the beginning of a system that would expand quietly for decades. Over the years that followed, reports of missing parishioners appeared with troubling frequency. It's isolated farmsteads, traveling preachers, orphaned children placed in church care. Each disappearance followed familiar explanations: wilderness dangers, illness, migration westward. Meanwhile, the Whitmore workshop prospered. Reliquaries became more intricate, containers more ornate. Congregations farther west began requesting tokens of sanctity to elevate their spiritual standing among neighboring settlements. The apprentices noticed irregularities. Jacob Miller reportedly questioned the origin of certain materials delivered under heavy canvas at night. Peter Collins, according to later testimony, voided the rear chamber entirely after glimpsing something hanging where no carved wood should be, but silence prevailed. Fear has a way of preserving loyalty. By the 1760s, relics crafted in Chester County had spread across 17 congregations from Philadelphia to the outer frontier, each piece attributed to unnamed martyrs, each fragment presented as sacred sacrifice. The Whitmore name became synonymous with divine artistry. Yet beneath the reverence lay an enterprise built on calculated deception, and the woods surrounding the property seemed to grow quieter with each passing year. By the spring of 1746, rumors began drifting westward from Philadelphia. An Episcopal parish in the city claimed to possess a sacred fragment said to belong to a long-forgotten European holy figure. The rector spoke cautiously of unexplained recoveries. 3 parishioners, each suffering from lingering illness, were said to have improved after private prayer in the presence of the relic. The fragment, he explained, had come through a trusted artisan with continental connections. That artisan was Nathaniel Whitmore. Within 5 years, the Whitmore enterprise had transformed from respected craftsmanship into something far more expansive. The workshop doubled in size. Additional apprentices were hired to handle the visible commission's communion vessels, engraved scripture panels, carved reliquary chests. None of them were allowed below the main floor. Beneath the workshop, accessible only through a concealed trapdoor behind a shelving unit, lay the cellar chamber where the true operation unfolded. Around this time, the Whitmores constructed a larger residence of stone and heavy timber, home befitting a family of influence. Their prosperity appeared earned, their reputation spotless. The memory of Mary Collins faded into the blur of frontier uncertainty. Others vanished in the years that followed: an elderly woman traveling alone to visit distant relatives, a preacher passing between settlements, a laborer without close kin. Each absence explained away by wilderness hazards or political unrest along contested territories. But internally, the Whitmores had altered their selection process. According to the entry, Elizabeth claimed she could sense which individuals possessed what she called resonant purity. She insisted certain bodies would yield relics of greater spiritual potency. She described dreams in which divine instruction guided her choices. This belief reshaped the family's justification. They were not killing, they convinced themselves. They were elevating. Nathaniel expanded his connections methodically. Letters were exchanged with ministers across Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and eventually Virginia. He spoke persuasively about sacred artifacts once confined to European cathedrals. He argued that Protestant congregations deserved symbols of equal reverence without bowing to Catholic authority. Thomas later wrote, Thomas became increasingly indispensable to his father's operations, though his later confession suggests growing internal conflict. William, by contrast, displayed unsettling fascination with refinement. He experimented with drying techniques, chemical mixtures, and structural alterations designed to mimic centuries of age. He kept meticulous notes. The daughters managed correspondence and finances with impressive precision. Investments were spread across legitimate ventures, land holdings, supply contracts, milling operations, ensuring that the family fortune appeared rooted in respectable enterprise. Then came revolution. Yet the turmoil of revolution also introduced unpredictability. Militia patrols increased. Travelers were scrutinized. Disappearances became harder to obscure amid wartime record-keeping. Pressure mounted. And inside the Whitmore household, fractures began to form. Thomas's writings grow darker during this period. He describes sleepless nights. He recounts arguments with William, whose detachment had hardened into something clinical. "We have crossed too far," Thomas wrote in one surviving fragment. "There is no sanctification in what we do. Only decay dressed in velvet." By the early 1790s, rumors began surfacing, whispers of irregularities in church inventories. A minister questioned the origin of a relic whose provenance shifted under scrutiny. A ledger entry failed to align with a recorded death. Then, abruptly, the Whitmores vanished. Throughout the Revolutionary War, the Whitmores mastered the art of appearing patriotic without committing too visibly to either cause. They donated modestly to local militias when British troops advanced. They extended quiet credit to loyalist congregations when control shifted. Their loyalty, like their trade, adapted to survival. Neutrality preserved profit. But by 1781, as independence drew near and communities looked toward rebuilding both nation and faith, the Whitmores saw something else: opportunity. War leaves grief. Grief seeks symbols, and symbols could be sold. Churches damaged during the conflict required restoration. Congregations fractured by loss hungered for renewed spiritual certainty. Revivalist fervor swept through towns desperate to interpret years of bloodshed. Demand for sacred artifacts surged beyond anything the Whitmores had seen before. It was William who proposed the next escalation. Sarah's recovered journal describes the conversation in trembling script. William spoke of purity as currency, said innocence carried unmatched spiritual weight. Father resisted. At first, in February of 1782, a boy named Joseph Miller vanished from a church-run orphan house in Philadelphia. 10 years old, small, solemn, known for leading evening prayers among the other children. His disappearance was noted, briefly investigated, then recorded as a likely runaway. 3 months later, a rural Pennsylvania church unveiled what it described as the preserved heart of a youthful martyr from the early centuries of Christianity. Within weeks, reports of answered prayers multiplied, particularly concerning sick children. Attendance doubled, donations tripled. Other congregations took notice. Between 1782 and 1785, at least 16 children disappeared from settlements within a day's ride of the Whitmore estate. All were orphans or from impoverished families. All lacked advocates capable of sustaining prolonged inquiry. Meanwhile, child relics commanded unprecedented prices. The Whitmore fortune multiplied accordingly. Land holdings expanded. Investments diversified. Political connections strengthened. Their prosperity insulated them from suspicion. But scale breeds vulnerability. To maintain production, the family brought 2 trusted apprentices partially into confidence. They were shown the cellar. They were sworn to secrecy. One of them, Daniel Foster, did not sleep well afterward. In the autumn of 1785, an unexpected complication emerged. A Quaker minister named Elijah Thompson was assigned to investigate troubling reports of relic veneration spreading even among traditionally austere congregations. Thompson was not easily swayed by spectacle. Before entering ministry, he had studied law. He understood documents, patterns, motive. His journal, later archived in restricted collections, records his unease. These objects appear wrapped in elaborate histories, yet their lineages dissolve upon inspection. I find reverence untethered from truth. In Philadelphia, he traced procurement chains. Again and again, they circled back through intermediaries, through benefactors, through carefully layered transactions, to Nathaniel Whitmore. In December 1785, Thompson visited Chester County. Nathaniel received him warmly. The public workshop was immaculate. Apprentices shaped chalices in plain sight. Shelves displayed beautifully crafted reliquary cases, empty. Nathaniel spoke eloquently about European contacts and sacred preservation traditions. He produced documents bearing seals and signatures. Too many, they would have sufficed. To Thompson, they did not. Inconsistencies lingered. Dates misaligned. Names repeated across unrelated claims. Still, suspicion is not proof. Thompson continued interviewing clergy who possessed Whitmore relics. He cataloged miracle testimonies. A pattern surfaced. Witnesses to the most dramatic healings often shared indirect ties to Whitmore associates. Certain individuals appeared repeatedly arriving shortly before reported miracles, departing soon after. A network manufactured validation. As Thompson pressed deeper, interference followed. Letters went astray. Notes vanished. Documents disappeared from locked storage. In February 1786, preparing to present his findings to the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, Thompson attended a private dinner hosted by a respected elder. That night, he collapsed. Physicians later concluded poisoning, though no culprit was identified. He survived, but weakness confined him for months. During his recovery, doubt spread among the committee that had commissioned him. Without evidence in hand, his claims seemed speculative. And in Chester County, the Whitmores accelerated their operations, yet within their own circle, fractures widened. Daniel Foster had seen too much. The cellar smells lingered in his clothes. The sounds lingered in memory. He began drinking heavily. He missed work. He spoke recklessly in taverns. William noticed first. Thomas worried. Nathaniel calculated. In the spring of 1787, Foster disappeared. Like previous victims, he had family. A brother who refused to accept vague explanations. A brother who sought out Elijah Thompson, though still weakened. Thompson listened carefully. For the first time, a living witness emerged. Someone who had entered the Whitmore cellar and returned. The brother described Daniel's final weeks, his agitation, his fear, his mention of hidden rooms and false saints. Thompson reopened his investigation. Quietly this time, he did not confront Nathaniel directly. Instead, he coordinated with two additional observers, one a former apprentice who had fled employment abruptly, another a tradesman who had delivered supplies to the workshop's rear entrance at odd hours. In the summer of 1788, under cover of night and armed with legal authorization secured through discreet channels, Thompson and local authorities approached the Whitmore property. The workshop appeared deserted. The main floor showed no irregularities. But behind a shelving unit misaligned by less than an inch, they discovered the concealed entry. The cellar had been scrubbed, tools removed, surfaces burned and scraped, yet traces remained, hooks embedded in beams, chemical residue in floor cracks, fragments too small to identify, but too human to dismiss. Nathaniel Whitmore was gone. Elizabeth and William had vanished days earlier. Thomas was apprehended weeks later attempting passage under an assumed name. His eventual written confession, fragmented, remorseful, and at times incoherent, became one of 3 testimonies sealed within Philadelphia archives. Publicly, the matter was minimized. Church leaders feared scandal more than truth. Many relics were quietly removed from display. Others remained rebranded, recontextualized, or forgotten in locked cabinets. The Whitmore estate was abandoned, the cellar filled, records restricted. History softened. But the fragments, those scattered, gilded containers resting in old churches across Pennsylvania and beyond, remain silent witnesses. And sometimes, in aging congregations where relics are stored but never discussed, caretakers report an unease they cannot explain. Not faith, not reverence, something heavier, as though the past refuses burial. Thomas Whitmore's expression revealed neither fear nor defiance, only exhaustion. Snow swirled into the workshop as he stepped aside without resistance. "You are expected," he said quietly. Inside, the air was unnaturally warm. A fire burned too hot in the hearth. Scent of resin and something sharper lingered beneath it. Nathaniel Whitmore sat at a work table, pale and diminished, his once commanding presence reduced by illness. Elizabeth stood behind him, hands folded, her posture composed. There was no sign of William. Elijah Thompson announced the authority under which they had come. His voice carried clearly despite the storm outside. Nathaniel did not argue. "You will find what you believe you seek," he replied faintly. "But you misunderstand its purpose. The The constables secured the family members while Thompson searched for the concealed entrance described by Sarah, behind a tall shelving unit along the rear wall. They found it a panel slightly misaligned, its hinges disguised beneath carved trim. When the door opened, a draft of cold, mineral air rose from below. Lanterns were lit. The descent began. James Pearson later wrote, "No sermon had prepared me for what waited beneath that floor." The cellar extended farther than anticipated beyond the original foundation into reinforced earthen chambers. Work tables lined the walls, hooks hung from beams. Shelves held velvet pouches labeled in careful script names, dates. Not codes, names. Along one wall stood glass containers holding preserved fragments submerged in liquid. Nearby, wooden crates bore church markings corresponding to congregations across multiple colonies. In a smaller adjoining chamber lay what Sarah had described. Archival samples, tiny preserved portions catalogued meticulously, each tagged with identifying information. A grotesque ledger of quality control. Thompson located Elizabeth's record book, hidden within a locked chest. It was intact. Page after page detailed acquisitions and distributions spanning decades. Dates matched disappearances. Recipients aligned with churches previously identified in Thompson's investigation. The evidence was overwhelming, but the most chilling discovery awaited at the far end of the chamber. 3 small forms lay upon a central table, partially prepared. The recent frontier children William had brought back. The storm above masked a sound none of the men initially recognized, a rear door slamming open. William Whitmore had returned. He had tracked Sarah to Philadelphia days earlier, discovered her absence, and raced back once he learned of Thompson's mobilization. Seeing lantern light in the cellar stairwell, he understood immediately. William did not descend. Instead, he moved toward the mine shaft on the western edge of the property, the secondary storage location Sarah had revealed. Elizabeth, realizing her son's intention, broke her silence for the first time that evening. "He means to burn it," she whispered. Smoke reached the cellar within minutes. William had set fire to the storage site, likely hoping to destroy relocated materials and create chaos enough for escape. Thompson ordered immediate evacuation of the cellar with the ledger and portable evidence. Above ground, wind-fed flames spread faster than William anticipated. Snow dampened some of the blaze, but the abandoned mine shaft burned fiercely, collapsing inward. Constables pursued William through the tree line. Counts differ on what happened next. Some report that he slipped along an icy ravine and fell. Others suggest he carried a pistol and refused capture. What is certain is that his body was recovered at dawn, broken among rocks below a steep embankment. Back at the workshop, Nathaniel offered no resistance as he was taken into custody. Thomas surrendered fully, later providing a written confession that corroborated much of Sarah's testimony. Elizabeth Whitmore vanished during the confusion of the fire. Despite organized search efforts, she was never conclusively located. Rumors placed her under an assumed name in another state. No proof emerged. The aftermath was swift and quiet. Church leaders, confronted with irrefutable documentation, faced a dilemma. Public disclosure would devastate congregations already fragile in the young republic's uncertain years. Decision was reached. The most egregious relics were discreetly removed and destroyed. Others, whose origins could not be conclusively proven, were sealed in storage and reclassified as symbolic artifacts. Official charges against the Whitmores focused narrowly fraud, unlawful handling of remains, falsified trade. The full scale of the crimes was suppressed. Nathaniel Whitmore died in confinement within a year. Thomas's confession, written in declining health, became one of 3 sealed testimonies archived in Philadelphia under restricted access. Sarah Whitmore lived the remainder of her life under Quaker protection, her role concealed to preserve fragile peace. Elijah Thompson's final journal entry regarding the case reads, "Justice, when it came, arrived cloaked in silence." Apt. Perhaps silence is the only mercy history affords such sins. The Whitmore property was abandoned, the workshop dismantled, the cellar filled and buried. Yet across Pennsylvania and beyond, ornate reliquaries still sit in forgotten cabinets, their origins softened by time and deliberate omission. Most are empty now. Some historians quietly admit were never fully inventoried. And in aging church basements, where relic boxes remain locked and undocumented, caretakers occasionally report a feeling difficult to name. Not reverence, not peace. Something older, as if fragments of the past still wait to be acknowledged. Thomas Whitmore was tried in Philadelphia later that year, though the proceedings were conducted with unusual restraint. Official charges centered on murder, desecration of remains, fraud, and conspiracy. Yet even within the courtroom, the full scale of the family's operation was carefully moderated in public record. The prosecution relied heavily on the ledger recovered from the underground archive, along with sworn testimonies from Thompson, Bradford, Pearson, and the surviving constable wounded at the mine shaft. Physical evidence preserved fragments, instruments, and anatomical diagrams was presented only to the court, not displayed openly to spectators. Thomas did not contest the material facts. He spoke calmly, almost academically, about the sacred enterprise his family had undertaken. He insisted no act had been random, no victim chosen without what he described as spiritual discernment. When pressed about the children, his composure faltered only briefly before he lowered his gaze and whispered, "Purity was essential." There was no dramatic outburst. No denial, only acceptance. Nathaniel Whitmore died before formal sentencing could be delivered. Fever and decline carried him off in confinement, reportedly murmuring scripture until his final breath. Thomas was convicted and sentenced to death. His execution was conducted quietly at dawn, witnessed by a limited assembly. No public spectacle was permitted. His final written statement, part confession, part theological justification, was sealed among Thompson's papers at the request of state officials. The broader scandal never erupted into the national reckoning it might have become. Church authorities who had unknowingly purchased the fabricated relics cooperated in private investigations. Many items were discreetly destroyed. Others, whose provenance could not be conclusively traced, were absorbed into collections without acknowledgement of their origins. Financial records revealed that the Whitmore wealth had indeed been funneled through land holdings, shipping investments, and legitimate trade. Much of it was seized. Some vanished into legal ambiguities that history never fully untangled. As for the salvaged relics Elizabeth and William carried into the forest, only a fraction were recovered at the cabin. Several boxes remained missing. Their contents were never catalogued. The Whitmore property was dismantled within 2 years, the workshop torn down. The underground chambers collapsed and filled, the mine shafts sealed permanently. Today, no visible structure remains. Yet in scattered church archives along the eastern seaboard, a handful of reliquaries bear acquisition dates corresponding precisely to entries in Elizabeth Whitmore's ledger. Their documentation lists saints whose names appear nowhere in recognized canon. Historians who have quietly cross-referenced those names with missing persons records from the mid-18th century have noted unsettling consistencies. Elijah Thompson's final annotation on the case reads, "We exposed what we could, we buried what we must. May time succeed where justice hesitated. The Whitmore bloodline ended in scandal and death. But silence carefully constructed, deliberately maintained, outlived them all. And in that silence, the darker legacy endured." Of particular interest to early medical researchers were the Whitmore's preservation methods. Though born from monstrous intent, their chemical formulations had reportedly achieved an unnatural longevity in organic tissue. References to the Chester compounds, as they were discreetly labeled in several 19th century medical correspondences, suggest that fragments of the family's technical knowledge may have circulated quietly among physicians seeking improved anatomical study techniques. No formal acknowledgement of this transfer was ever recorded. But in 1819, a Boston surgical lecturer made cryptic reference to certain proprietary methods of frontier origin capable of retarding putrefaction beyond customary expectations. Scholars have long debated whether this was coincidence or something inherited from darker sources. When the 100-year seal expired in 1888, the documents were technically eligible for release. Yet by then, many of the churches involved had merged, relocated, or lost their early records to fire and war. Interest in colonial scandals had faded beneath the pressures of industrial expansion and national reconstruction. Only fragments of the Whitmore file were quietly catalogued within historical archives. Much of the material remained restricted, not by law, but by mutual understanding. Those who did examine the sealed testimonies described them as deeply unsettling, not merely for the crimes themselves, but for the institutional response that followed. The calculated decision to prioritize stability over truth raised uncomfortable questions about the fragile balance between faith and fear in the early republic. Today, the Whitmore name survives mostly in obscurity. The original property boundaries in Chester County are now farmland and scattered residential plots. No visible marker indicates what once stood there. Ground surveys conducted in the early 20th century noted irregular soil density consistent with collapsed underground structures, but no formal excavation was ever commissioned. More troubling are the relic inventories. Independent researchers in the late 1900s identified at least 9 reliquaries in small northeastern churches bearing acquisition dates between 1760 and 1787, with vague provenance descriptions such as gift of a devout benefactor or authenticated by private devotion. In several cases, associated miracle claims predate the exposure of the Whitmore enterprise. Whether those remains were ever replaced or quietly retained cannot be conclusively determined. Elijah Thompson's Registry of Identified Victims, rediscovered in partial form in 1924, contained 81 confirmed names. Cross-referencing with parish disappearance notices suggests the true number may have been higher. Many entries are marked with a single word, unrecovered. The darkest element of the Whitmore legacy may not be the crimes themselves, but the silence that followed. An agreement unspoken, yet rigidly maintained that some truths once uncovered must be carefully contained, and so the story survived only in sealed memoranda, scattered correspondences, and the haunted writings of a woman who spent 4 decades seeking redemption for horrors she helped expose. If you stand today in certain aging churches along the eastern seaboard, you may find small glass-fronted reliquaries tucked into shadowed alcoves. Their labels speak of unnamed saints. Their origins are described only as colonial. Few parishioners question them. Fewer still know why some archivists refuse to catalog their contents too closely. The Whitmore bloodline ended in execution, poison, and exile, but legacy is not always carried in descendants. Sometimes it lingers in objects, sometimes in silence, and sometimes in the quiet decision not to look too closely at what history chose to bury. William Whitmore's preservation formulas were said to maintain not only the appearance but even the flexibility of organic tissue and achievement that, while born of unspeakable intent, drew quiet fascination from early anatomical scholars. Several early 19th century medical journals contain veiled references to frontier preservation techniques capable of delaying decay beyond accepted limits. None mention the Whitmore name directly, yet the similarities to descriptions found in the sealed 1788 case files are difficult to ignore. For nearly a century, the story might have remained permanently buried. Then, in 1879, a fire swept through a Philadelphia courthouse. Clerks scrambled to salvage water-damaged records. Several sealed packets from the Whitmore proceedings were mistakenly transferred with routine documents. A junior clerk reportedly glimpsed sections of Thomas Whitmore's confession before supervisors intervened and resealed the materials. Rumor spread. Within weeks, a reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer published a sensational article outlining a supposed colonial conspiracy involving fabricated relics and hidden crimes. The piece, printed on November 17, 1879, coincidentally, 134 years after the first recorded Whitmore victim, caused brief public outrage. Religious leaders denounced it as slander. Without official documentation to support the claims, the paper retracted the story. Silence settled once more. By then, many churches that had knowingly retained Whitmore relics had either discreetly disposed of them or allowed institutional memory to fade. As clergy passed away, so too did uncomfortable knowledge. What remained were objects stripped of context, absorbed into tradition. In 1923, during renovations at the Pennsylvania Historical Society, workers discovered a concealed compartment behind shelving in a restricted archive room. Inside were the complete sealed Whitmore records apparently hidden there decades earlier by Elijah Thompson himself as protection against destruction. The Society preserved the documents under an intentionally vague catalog title. Access required special approval. Through this controlled scholarship, historians gradually reconstructed the scope of the Whitmore enterprise and its unsettling implications. For early American religious culture, a discreet survey conducted in 1967 identified 11 churches in the eastern United States, possessing artifacts matching descriptions in Elizabeth Whitmore's ledger. Reactions from church officials ranged from cooperative investigation to firm denial. In most cases, current leaders were unaware of the object's possible origins. The Harmony Meeting House, where the Whitmores once worshipped, still stands. Though abandoned since the 1930s, repurposed over time as a schoolhouse and later a community hall, it now sits empty. Locals speak of an unexplainable heaviness near the structure after dusk, a claim impossible to verify, yet persistent in oral history. In 1992, ground-penetrating radar surveys of the former Whitmore property revealed anomalies consistent with collapsed subterranean chambers and a sealed mine shaft. Limited excavation confirmed structural remnants matching historical descriptions, though no remains were recovered. The site was reburied at the request of current landowners and designated historically significant, but closed to the public. The final verified Whitmore artifact surfaced in 2005 during renovations at a small Lutheran church in western Pennsylvania. Workers uncovered a hidden compartment containing a velvet pouch and an 18th-century letter. Subsequent testing confirmed the object was human tissue. The remains were interred in the church cemetery beneath a simple marker, "Unknown child of God, finally at rest." Today, the land where the Whitmore workshop once stood remains curiously unused. Multiple owners reported failed crops and livestock avoiding a particular patch of soil, though agricultural experts attribute this to drainage irregularities and mineral imbalance. Still, local legend persists. Yet perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Whitmore case is not archaeological, is psychological. The revelation that sacred objects, revered for generations, may have originated in calculated deception forces an unsettling question: how much of belief depends on truth, and how much on faith alone? Contemporary accounts recorded genuine experiences, healings, visions, answered prayers linked to objects later exposed as fraudulent. Were these instances of suggestion, collective hope, or evidence that meaning arises not from the object itself, but from the devotion placed upon it? The Whitmore case challenges institutions, historians, and believers alike to confront an uncomfortable paradox. Can something born of evil still inspire good through belief? And if so, what does that say about us? If this exploration into hidden American history captured your attention, consider supporting the channel and joining our community of mystery seekers. Stories like this remind us that history is rarely as simple or as settled as it appears. Because sometimes the darkest chapters are not erased. They are archived. Sometimes they are waiting quietly on a forgotten shelf. Locals claim that on certain autumn nights, especially around November 17th, faint glow appears where the Whitmore workshop once stood. No building has occupied that land for over 2 centuries, yet some insist they can still trace its outline against the darkness. Whether legend, imagination, or the persistence of memory, the story endures. If this account of hidden exploitation and manufactured sanctity unsettled you, share it with someone who appreciates the darker corners of history. Support the channel with a like and subscribe so you never miss our future investigations into the shadows of America's past. Because stories like this raise uncomfortable questions. The Whitmore case is not only about crime, it is about memory. It reveals how easily institutions, when threatened, can reshape narratives. When truth endangers stability, it is often sealed away, reclassified, or quietly forgotten. What we inherit as history is sometimes less a complete record and more a carefully curated survival. For the victims, devout men and women whose remains were misused, and especially the children whose names were erased, the deepest tragedy may not only be what happened to them, but how thoroughly their identities were obscured. To be forgotten is a second death. Somewhere in eastern Pennsylvania lie unmarked graves holding portions of those individuals. Other fragments may still rest within aging reliquaries preserved by tradition, but separated from their true stories. That fragmentation mirrors history itself, pieces displayed, pieces hidden, and the full truth scattered across time. The next time you walk into an old church and notice an artifact resting behind glass, perhaps you'll pause and wonder about its journey. In that moment of reflection, you honor those whose stories nearly vanished, because remembering is an act of restoration. The Whitmore mystery forces us to confront difficult truths about belief, power, and the human tendency to protect institutions over individuals. It reminds us that devotion can be manipulated and that silence can be deliberate. So what do you think? Was the entire truth uncovered? Or could remnants of this history still lie hidden in plain sight? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you're drawn to stories where history and darkness intertwine, subscribe and turn on notifications. There are many more forgotten chapters waiting to be explored, and sometimes the past is not gone. It is simply buried quietly beneath our feet.